Today's training session will cover the transaction approval process. We will review the transaction approval settings within the Clear Benefits system, and we will review the related features. To access the transaction approval settings, you go to the Admin tab. Under Custom Settings, Custom Features. You click the Edit button, and halfway down the screen, you will see various checkboxes and drop-down menus pertaining to the transaction approval settings. The first two checkboxes pertain to what types of, well, not what types of transactions, but who originates the transactions. And depending on who originates the transactions, whether or not they are included in the transactions for your approval or review. The first checkbox is labeled Approval Required for Transactions Done by Employee. Therefore, transactions originated by the employee or the employer logged in as the employee will be presented for your approval or for your review. The second checkbox, if selected, would include transactions originated by the employer. This checkbox is labeled Approval Required for Transactions Done by Employer. The following section lists the types of changes that can be included in the transaction approval process. Each change type has a drop-down menu next to it with the following values: enabled, disabled, or notification only. If you select enabled, this change type will be included in the transaction approval process and be presented to you on the transaction approval screen. This transaction would not be approved or would remain pending until you approve it, and therefore it would not be included in the EDI file to the carrier until the approval process is complete. If you select disabled in the drop-down menu, this transaction type will not be included in the transaction approval process. If you choose the value notification only, then the transaction will be presented for you to review, but it will not remain in pending status. The transaction will be complete, and therefore it will be included in the next EDI file to the carrier. The last column of checkboxes is headed Form Submission. If there is a paper form associated with this change type that must be submitted to Human Resources, then you may select this checkbox, and on the transaction approval screen, you will have a checkbox, and the checkbox must be completed or marked off once the form is submitted to Human Resources. These settings here determine what you view on the transaction approval screen. The transaction approval screen is always accessible by clicking the Messages icon at the top. That brings you to the Message Center, which you view upon logging into the system. The first item under Message Center is the Transaction Approval Review section. Here, it will indicate the number of transactions that are pending. You may click on the number that is linked, and that will bring you to the transaction approval screen. The top part of the screen lists all the transactions presented for your approval and review. Each item has an approve and reject checkbox. It also has the received form column, and that checkbox is enabled if the form submission checkbox was selected in the transaction approval settings. And it also presents a send email option that we will review in a moment. The employee's name is displayed, transaction date, the change type, and also a detail link where you can click and view the detail of the transaction. Please note that in the detail of the transaction, it is further broken down by plan type. Therefore, you can approve or reject or send an email regarding these individual plan type transactions. At the bottom part of the screen, here are the changes not requiring approval, but for review only. These items appear here if you pick the notification only value in the drop-down menu in the settings. Here, instead of the approval and rejection checkboxes, you have a clear checkbox to mark off. Also, if you had selected form submission in the settings, this checkbox would be enabled. The detail link is also available to provide detail regarding the transaction. If we go back to the Settings area under the Admins tab, under Custom Settings and Customs Features, and again click the Edit button, we will review the different change types listed here. There are quite a few different change types available to you for you to customize them in accordance with your human resources, processes, and procedures. Some of these change types are subsets of other change types. For example, the flexible spending account enrollment and changes. If you would like to view all changes pertaining to flexible spending accounts, you would enable this feature. If the new hire enrollment feature is enabled, all new hire transactions, including flexible spending account transactions for new hires, will be included in this change type. Therefore, the flexible spending account enrollment and changes is a subset of this new hire enrollment change type group. Similarly, for add dependent, add new child, and delete dependent, these transactions can be enabled separately, and you will view those change types if the non-OE enrollment changes is disabled. But if non-OE enrollment changes is enabled, those change types are included in the non-OE enrollment changes, and therefore you would not view them separately, but instead, because they are a subset of the non-OE enrollment changes, you would view transactions and the detail of those transactions under this change type listed on the transaction approvals. Again, if we go back to the message board to access the transaction approval screen, you will see the different listed. When I had FSA enrollment change enabled and new hire disabled, that is why this transaction for new to employee is listed separately. Again, if the new hire enrollment change type was enabled, even though it included a spending enrollment changes, we would only see that transaction listed as a new hire enrollment. We have reviewed the transaction approval settings, the difference between the employee and employer originated transactions, the difference between approval notification, how that affects your EDI files to the carrier, the form submission feature, and the various changed. We've reviewed the different change types and how they're included in the other change type listed. For example, the dependents included in non-OE and the FSA included in new hires, the new hire transactions. And in a moment, we'll review pending approvals. We will now review pending approvals, and then we will follow with the additional features related to the transaction settings. When a transaction is pending, we will go into a test employee's information and go into the benefits enrollment screen. Generally, when there are no pending approvals and you click on the benefits enrollment link, that will bring you to the benefits enrollment screen, listing out the current enrollment information for the employee. With pending approvals, with pending approvals, you will see two buttons, the first for current elections and a separate button for those pending approval. If we click on that button, you will see the detail regarding the pending approvals. You can see here this test employee has a pending approval for a flexible spending account. If we go to his current election on his benefits enrollment screen, you will see his pending approvals are highlighted in yellow. If we go to the Edit Benefits Enrollment screen, you can see that there also is a note in this transaction is pending approval. If we go to the Print Forms link, you will see that the print forms pertaining to the pending approvals are listed separately. Please note that when you go to the transaction approval screen, under the details section, you will see that transactions, as indicated earlier, are separately approved. In this instance, medical, dental, and vision changes were submitted for approval. The medical transaction was rejected, and the dental and vision remain pending for approval or rejection. If we go to the detail for this additional test employee, here's another example of when a new child is added, the plan type related, or the plan type transactions related to this additional employee or additional child may be approved separately also. Now we will review the related features, beginning with user rights of employer-restricted users. We go to the Admin tab under the User Rights section. You see the employer-restricted users listed here. In this case, we have one employer-restricted user, and if we click on that name, we will see the rights assigned to this employer-restricted user, and also the employee access groups that he or she may make changes to or view information of. The last two checkboxes on this screen pertains to transaction approvals. The first is labeled Send Change Notification Emails and provide approval privileges for this user for all locations, classes, divisions, regardless of above settings. In this case, this checkbox has been marked off and is enabled, or has been selected. Therefore, this particular employer-restricted user will be able to approve transactions for all locations, divisions, and departments, regardless of what has been selected above. Therefore, when this user goes to his transaction approval screen, automatically transactions pertaining to all employees will go to his screen for approval. On the other hand, if instead this last box was selected, which is labeled Authorize this user to approve transactions, then only the departments, locations, and classes which are selected above, only those employer groups' transactions will appear on this employer-restricted user's transaction approval screen. The next related feature I will review is the email setting. If you remember, on the transaction approval screen, there is this additional column to send an email. You may check Approve Transaction and Send Email if the Send Email box is enabled, or you may check Reject Transaction and Send Email. By doing so, upon approval or rejection of the transaction, an email will be sent to the employee notifying them of the approval or rejection. You can set up the email notification information at Account Settings under the Email Settings link. If we go to Transaction Approval Rejection Email Notification, the link listed here towards the bottom, we will see a screen where you can set up the email information. The approval notification email setup is first, and a similar section is available for the rejection notification setup. Each setup screen is the same. You may customize the subject heading. You may also customize the text in the body of the message. There's default language provided for you if you choose to use that. You may also elect to include a signature line of user approval transactions. In the signature line, you can choose to include the name, the job title, or the email address and work phone number of the user approving the transaction. This may be helpful to the employee. Upon receiving the email, they'll know who to contact within Human Resources if this information is provided in the email. If we go to this particular test employee and look at his email history, we can see that this employee has a transaction approval notification email in his history. We could see that the email was sent on a particular date with information pertaining to the transaction. You also have the ability, as with other emails in email history, to resend the email if you choose to by clicking the resend link. I would also like to review with you what happens when multiple transactions are pending or a transaction is pending and you would like to change that information or override it. If we go into another employee's record, into their benefits enrollment screen, and go to edit the life enrollment, we can see that there's information related to the pending transaction. At the top of the screen, you can see the effective date of this transaction was May 27th. If we try to change the election using today's date, you can see that this transaction is for one, well, other than this other error above, this transaction is not being processed by the system because a prior request has not been approved. In order to overwrite the existing transaction, what we will want to do is select the same effective date as the previous transaction. By choosing the same effective date, the system allows us to overwrite the prior transaction. What I would also like to show you is when a transaction has been rejected, in this employee's history, what appears is an additional link labeled Rejected Changes History. By clicking on this link, you can view the detail of the rejected transaction. For this particular employee, you can see that the subscriber ID feature has been activated for him, and the subscriber ID boxes are viewable for each of the types of coverage: vision, dental, and medical. But notice that the subscriber ID information is still being reflected in the vision and dental areas, whereas the medical plan subscriber ID is blank. If we go back to the rejected change history information, note that it was the medical transaction, the medical plan transaction, that was rejected. Therefore, when the transaction is rejected and it has subscriber ID number associated with it, the system does not store the ID. The ID will be erased, not stored in the system, and you will find this field blank. On the other hand, given the dental and vision plan transactions are still pending, that information is still stored in the system. That concludes the transaction approval process training.